Hey everybody, welcome back. Before you can animate anything in Adobe After Effects, you're going to need a composition. A composition is essentially a container that defines the size, the various timing, and the visual format of your anticipated motion design. In this video, we're going to create a composition from scratch. We're going to review its essential settings, go over some of the elements that you might want to adjust, and create another composition directly from imported footage. So let's go ahead and get started. As you open Adobe After Effects, I want you to make sure that you're under Workspace and in the standard workspace. If you don't have this, you can go ahead and hit the Reset Saved Layout to make sure your screen looks like mine. As I mentioned, you can think of a composition kind of like a scene or a sequence or even an artboard with a timeline attached to it. A single After Effects project can actually have multiple compositions. Yours most likely will have compositions within compositions and so forth. You might have one for the lower third and a final composition that combines everything on top of one video. To create a new composition, you can create this in a few different ways. The most obvious is this giant button in the middle that's entitled New Composition. By clicking this, you're going to open your composition settings. Let's go ahead and left click. These are your composition settings, which we'll get to in a few seconds, but let me show you a few other ways to quickly make compositions. Let's go ahead and left click on Cancel and navigate to the project window. You can create a composition by also clicking on the composition icon, which kind of looks like a little film strip with 3 different shapes in it. So if I left click on that, you guessed it, composition settings. The third way is you can right click inside of the project panel and choose New Composition. This will also get you the project settings. Finally, you can go to Composition, New Composition, or hit the Command or Control N key to pull up the composition dialog box. Now, in the composition settings, we have a few options. Now, if you're going to take the ACP exam, you're going to want to know how to navigate these options because you might be asked to either create a new composition from scratch or edit a pre-existing composition, which I'll show you in a few minutes. But first here, we're going to change the composition name. We're going to call this one main_comp for composition, and let's look at some of the settings. So as we look through the settings, you see you have a various amount of presets. The presets typically define the type of resolution that the image or video is going to be. It also defines the aspect ratio and the frames per second to help you define what type of animation you're going to use. So here we have options in HD, 4K, and we even have some fun social media options such as you would use for TikTok or Instagram Reels. For this lesson, let's go ahead and choose the HD 1920 by 1080, 29.97 frames per second. This is a great way to kind of adjust. Now, once you have a preset, you can continue to change this. For instance, if I want to change these values to a custom number, I can do so. If I want them to be uniform, let's say I type 1080 here, you'll notice that it changes the height as well. If I want to change both values independently, I can go ahead and do that by unchecking the lock aspect ratio. At any point, if you need to go back to those custom presets, you can go and left click on those and adjust them. We have our square pixel ratios here. We also have the ability to change the frame rate of a composition. So we get some options here as well. We can change that starting resolution, which we learned about in our first video. This will help speed up your process when you're doing motion design because it will give you a preview mode rather than the full mode, and it will actually help it play back a little faster. Finally, we have our time code here as well as our duration. Our duration is where we set the time of the comp. So here I'm going to type 10 in that second column. That will be 10 seconds. And finally, we have the background color in which we can change the background color. Now, by default, the background is going to be black. This is essentially not an image. It's just going to be kind of a placeholder until we add a background of our liking. The final couple things I want you to look at are these tabs at the top. In the Advanced tab, you have things like shutter angle. Shutter angle is going to clearly affect things like motion blur. So if I turn this to 0, if I type a 0 there, that means I'm going to get very little blur on elements. If I crank it up to 180 or even higher. When I do activate motion blur, that blur will be more visually present. We do have a 3D render category, which we'll cover in another video, but for the most part, knowing your basic elements first and then your advanced settings are really the way to go. Once we find the settings that we like and we review them, we're going to hit OK, and that's going to create the main comp in your project panel. Now, what I like to do is actually like to create bins or folders within that to help organize. So I'm going to go and left click on Create New Folder, and I'm going to call this Comps. I'm going to then left click drag the main comp into the comps folder. This just really allows me to keep things organized. I may go back down and click New Folder again and type Assets. And as we learned in the first video, we can double click and we can go ahead and navigate to our specific files, grab some stock video, drag that into the assets folder, and then everything is nice, neat, and organized. So this is going to definitely help. Now, at any point, if you want to edit the composition size, it's actually really easy. You would just go ahead and highlight your main comp, go to Composition, and choose Composition Settings. This will bring back that original dialog box. So for instance, if we want to make this for social media, I can type 1080 by 1920. As you can see, the dialog box will adjust appropriately. Some other things to consider when you're working in compositions is remember that scroll wheel will zoom in and out. You can also use the fit function here with this little drop down. If you want to see a transparent background and toggle your transparency grid, you can go ahead and just left click on this icon in the composition panel. So as you can see, that black is kind of like a placeholder for the time being. And then another really important one to play with is if you go over to this kind of target icon, you can actually choose different guides, rulers, and grids. So things like title action safe will allow you to have spots for your title and then guidelines for your action elements as you see fit. We can also add things like grids. We can continue to left click and check on them, or even pull in our ruler guidelines that work really, really well, kind of like they would in Photoshop and Illustrator, where you just left click and drag to go ahead and set various markers to help you. Now your composition will appear as a tab in the bottom. Let's go ahead and make a second composition from the footage that we imported. So if you haven't already, double click and import some footage. This can be an image, this can be a video file like we have, like this MP4. And we're going to right click on this and we're going to do something a little different from the past two videos. We're going to create a new composition from a selection. When I click that, it's going to name that composition, which we'll drag down into our comps folder, the title of the video. It also now gives us access to two tabs here at the bottom. Now, if you want to rename something, it's actually very easy. You just highlight the composition and hit the return key or the enter key and say my first video comp, hit enter, and there you have it. At any point, you can adjust that. And if you lose these, and I'm going to go ahead and just delete or X out of that one tab, just double click on that again and it will appear at the bottom. Before we begin any sort of animation, we really want to think about what the composition size, the name, the frame rate, the pixel aspect ratio, and the duration is. And this is going to actually help us determine the size of our composition. Now that compositions are configured, our next step is thinking about all the different types of artwork beyond just video that we can bring into the project to start building our animation. Go ahead and give yourself a few minutes to explore creating different compositions, changing their settings, and organizing your project panel, and I'll see you in the next video.